The morning Eleanor Voss buried her husband, the men of Clearwater, Texas, were already placing bets on how long she would last. She stood at the edge of the freshly turned earth in the spring of 1878, wearing a black dress that had been let out twice at the seams because she had grown stronger over the years of ranch work. And she listened to the preacher read from the book of Job, while the dry wind came down from the north and pressed against her cheeks like a cold hand. Her daughter, Clara, 7 years old and solemn as a church elder, held her mother's fingers so tightly that Eleanor could feel the pulse in the child's small hand. Around them stood a scattering of townsfolk, some out of genuine sympathy, some out of curiosity, and behind the ring of mourners, at a respectful but observable distance, stood Harold Greer, the banker, watching the proceedings with the patient, calculating expression of a man who was already thinking about what the land might sell for. George Voss had been 34 years old when an infected cut from a rusted fence post took him in the space of 8 days. He had been a decent man, a hard worker and a good father, and Eleanor had loved him in the steady, reliable way that two people who build something together learn to love, not with fireworks but with the deep, quiet permanence of river rock. Now he was gone, and the Voss Ranch, 412 acres of good grassland along Clearwater Creek, a main house, 2 barns, 6 working horses, and a herd of 240 cattle was hers. She was 28 years old. The town assumed she would fail. It was not a cruel assumption exactly. It was simply the mathematics of life as Clearwater understood it. Ranching was man's work. The branding and the driving and the fence mending and the negotiating with buyers from Fort Worth, all of it required a man's back and a man's reputation, and Eleanor Voss had neither, in their estimation. She had a little girl, a handful of ranchlands, a foreman named Pete Dawson who was 61 and had a bad knee, and a debt on the northern 40 acres that came due in October. Harold Greer had offered to buy the land the very afternoon of the funeral. He had come to the house, hat in hand, face arranged into an expression of sympathy that sat on his features like a costume, and he had set a figure on the table that was 40 cents on the dollar for what the land was worth. Eleanor had looked at that figure for a long moment while Clara sat in the corner drawing pictures of horses in the dirt floor with a stick. "Thank you, Mr. Greer," she had said, folding the paper and sliding it back across the table, "but I am not ready to make any decisions just yet." He had smiled, the smile of a man who believed patience was his greatest advantage, and said, "Of course, Mrs. Voss, whenever you are ready, the offer will remain." She had shown him the door. That night, after Clara was asleep, Eleanor had sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and George's account ledger and gone through every number twice. The cattle were in reasonable shape. The spring calving had gone well. If she could get the herd to market in Fort Worth by September, she could pay the note on the North 40 and have money left for winter supplies. It was tight, but it was possible. She had closed the ledger, pressed her palm flat against its cover, and said aloud to nobody in the room, "All right, then." The weeks that followed were the hardest of her life. Pete Dawson was loyal and experienced, but his knee kept him from riding more than a few hours without serious pain, and the 2 young hands she had, brothers named Ruddy and Carl Simmons, were willing enough but green, and prone to looking at Eleanor with that particular expression that young men gave to women who presumed to tell them what to do. She ignored it and told them what to do anyway. She was up before dawn every day. She repaired a section of the south fence that had been sagging since before George died. She moved cattle from the east pasture to the north, where the grass was thicker after the spring rains. She treated a heifer with a respiratory infection that Pete had written off, and the heifer survived. She did all of this in skirts that she had shortened and hemmed so they would not catch on brush, with her dark brown hair pinned back so severely under her hat that the pins left little red marks at her temples each evening. In town, people talked. Martha Greer, Harold's wife, who was no more likable than her husband but at least openly so, told the women at the general store that Eleanor Voss was riding fences in men's boots. This was true. Eleanor had borrowed a pair of George's work boots and stuffed the toes with rags because his feet were larger than hers, and she wore them without apology. The minister's wife, a gentle woman named Agnes Hartley, brought a pie out to the ranch one afternoon in May and sat with Eleanor on the porch while Clara played with the barn cats, and said, with genuine kindness, "Eleanor, dear, perhaps there is a cousin who could come help. Or even, I know Harold Greer's offer was not ideal, but there are other buyers who might—" "I am not selling," Eleanor said, and said it without sharpness as a statement of plain fact. "I am ranching." Agnes Hartley had patted her hand and eaten her own pie in thoughtful silence. The second month was harder. One of the horses, a big chestnut gelding named Broad that had been George's favorite, threw a shoe and went lame, and the farrier in town was backed up for 2 weeks. Ruddy Simmons made a mess of a branding morning that cost them half a day's work, and left Eleanor so frustrated she had to walk to the edge of the creek and stand in the water in her boots until she felt calm enough to go back and be civil. And a section of the creek bank was eroding on the south property line, threatening a section of good grazing land if it wasn't shored up before the summer rains. She was mending saddle leather on the porch one evening in early June when Pete Dawson came hobbling up from the bunkhouse with an expression on his weathered face that told her something was wrong before he opened his mouth. "Mrs. Voss," he said, and he was the only person in Clearwater who still called her that, which she had come to appreciate because it meant he took her seriously. "I need to talk to you straight." "Sit down, Pete." He sat in the other porch chair and put his hat on his knee. "My knee is worse. Doc Rollins says I need to stop riding entirely for at least 2 months or risk losing function in the joint. I can still do light work around the yard. But I can't ride the range." Eleanor set down the leather and the awl. She looked out at the land, the long, gold-lit grass, the dark thread of the creek, the cattle moving like slow, brown clouds in the distance. She breathed in and breathed out. "All right," she said. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "Don't be sorry, rest your knee. We will manage." She said it with more confidence than she felt, because Pete Dawson's morale mattered to the ranch in ways that went beyond what he could physically accomplish, and she would not let him feel guilty on top of everything else. After he went back to the bunkhouse, she sat alone in the falling dark and thought hard about the numbers. Ruddy and Carl Simmons were not enough to work the range and the yard both, not with Pete grounded. She needed another hand. She had enough to pay a hand's wages for 2 months if she was careful about everything else. She posted a notice at the Clearwater General Store the next morning. "Range hand wanted. Voss Ranch, Clearwater Creek Road. Inquire in person. Honest wages for honest work." She put it up on a Thursday. By Monday, no one had come. The owner of the general store, a man named Denton who was kind but hopelessly honest, told her when she stopped in for salt that a couple of men had read the notice and then asked whose ranch it was, and when he told them it was the Voss widow's place, they had not seemed interested. "I imagine they figure it won't last long enough to be worth starting," Denton said, and then looked immediately sorry for having said it. "I appreciate your honesty," Eleanor said, and bought her salt and went home. She had started to wonder, in the privacy of her own mind, in the late nights when the lamp was low and Clara was breathing softly in her little bed across the room, whether the town was right. Not because she lacked the will, she had never in her life lacked will, but because there were simply physical limits to what one woman and 2 green boys and a lame foreman could accomplish in a Texas summer. The cattle needed to be ready for the drive in September. The creek bank needed shoring. The north fence was starting to show new weaknesses that she had not had time to address. The list was growing faster than she could work through it, and the days were not getting longer. She was out at dawn on the second Wednesday of June, riding the south pasture on a gray mare named Juniper, when she heard a horse on the road. The road that ran along the southern edge of the Voss property connected Clearwater to the smaller settlement of Ridgeway, 12 miles east, and it was not uncommon for travelers to pass along it. Eleanor registered the sound without particular interest and kept her attention on the fence line she was checking. Then she realized the horse had slowed and stopped. She turned in the saddle. A man sat on a tall bay horse at the edge of the road, looking at the notice she had nailed to her own fence post, a second copy of the same notice she had put in town. He was reading it with his head tilted slightly to the right, the way people did when something made them think rather than just register. He was wearing a worn canvas work shirt and a brown hat with a wide brim that had been shaped by years of weather rather than intention. And he had the build of a man who had done serious physical work for a long time, broad through the shoulders, easy in the saddle in the particular way of someone who had spent more of his life on a horse than off one. He looked up and found her watching him. For a moment neither of them spoke. The morning was very still, with only the calling of a meadowlark somewhere in the grass and the soft tearing sound of his horse cropping at the roadside weeds. "This your place?" he asked. He had a low, steady voice, not particularly loud, the kind of voice that didn't need to push itself. "It is," Eleanor said. He looked back at the notice for a moment, then back at her. "You looking for range work or yard work?" "Range primarily. Fencing, moving cattle, general horseback work." "I have a foreman who is temporarily grounded and 2 young hands who need supervision." He nodded, absorbing this without any of the visible skepticism she had been braced for. "How long is the work?" "Through September drive at minimum. If we are both satisfied after that, I would consider winter wages for the right hand." "What are the wages?" she told him. He did not flinch at the number, did not negotiate, did not make the small face that men sometimes made when they thought a woman had named a price she did not understand. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You may. They said in Ridgeway that you were running this place alone since your husband passed. Said the town figures you'll sell before summer is out." Eleanor met his eyes across the distance between them. She was sitting very straight on Juniper, and the morning light was behind her, and she said, in a voice that was perfectly level, "The town has been saying that since April." Something shifted in his expression, not pity, not skepticism, but something that looked more like interest. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Show me." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. Show me the ranch. The cattle, the fence situation, what needs doing. If it's workable, I'll sign on." She studied him for a moment. He was perhaps 30 years old, she judged, maybe a year or two older than she was, with a face that had been weathered by sun and wind, and showed a careful, direct quality in the eyes that she was inclined to trust, though she was experienced enough to know that trustworthy-looking men could still be wrong for a situation. She had not lived long enough to be naive, and she had not buried a husband and faced down a banker to start being careless now. "Get down off your horse," she said, "and come through the gate." His name was Jesse Holt. He was 31 years old, originally from New Mexico Territory, and he had spent the last decade as a working cowhand trail drives, ranch work, some time in Kansas and Colorado, and 2 seasons in the Texas Panhandle. He had references if she wanted them, names of ranchers he had worked for who would speak to his character. He mentioned all of this while following her on his bay horse through the south pasture, keeping his eyes on the land rather than on her, which she found instinctively correct. She showed him everything. The south fence, the creek bank erosion, the north 40 where the grass had grown thick and needed rotating cattle through it carefully to avoid overgrazing. She showed him the cattle from a distance, the herd spread across the middle pasture in the June heat, well-bodied, healthy-looking, a good mix of steers and young cows that represented everything she and George had built over 7 years. She showed him the barns, the tack room, the state of the equipment. She showed him where Pete Dawson was in the bunkhouse with his knee wrapped, and Pete looked up at the stranger with a careful, assessing look that a man gave another man when the woman of the house had brought him in. "Pete," Eleanor said, "this is Jesse Holt. He may be our new hand." Pete Dawson extended a hand and Jesse shook it, and some quiet communication happened between them in the way of men who had both lived rough lives, and Pete nodded fractionally, which Eleanor filed away as meaningful. Then she took Jesse to the problem she had been saving for last, the section of north fence where 2 posts had rotted and a third was healing over, and 3 steers had pushed through 2 days ago, and she had spent half a morning getting them back. She had plugged the gap temporarily with a salvaged rail, but it was not going to hold. Jesse dismounted, handed his reins to Eleanor without thinking about it, just naturally, as if they were partners, and crouched beside the rotted post. He dug at the base of it with his boot, checked the ground, looked along the fence line. He stood up and looked at the line of posts in both directions with a practiced squint. "You have posts?" he asked. "6 in the barn. Wire, 2 spools. I can have this section solid by tomorrow afternoon." He said it simply, not as a boast, just as a fact about what was achievable. Eleanor looked at him. He was standing in the full morning sunlight, and he had already taken off his hat to wipe his forehead. It was warming up fast, and she could see that he had dark hair with some gray at the temples, and that his hands, when he replaced his hat and looked at her, were the hands of a man who had worked with them every day of his adult life. "Why are you looking for ranch work?" she asked, because it had been on her mind the whole morning. "You have the kind of experience that would get you work anywhere in Texas." He was quiet for a moment. "I was foreman on a place in the Panhandle for 2 years. Owner sold it without much notice to a land company out of Dallas. The new owners brought their own men." He paused. "I've been drifting some since then. I'd rather be working." It was a straightforward answer, and it matched up with everything she observed about him: the neatness of his kit, the quality of his horse, the evident competence, none of which suggested a man who had been idle by choice. She thought about the references he had offered and decided she would write to at least one of them. "I will need a week before I can say you have the job permanently," she said. "But I will pay you for the week at the regular rate regardless. If you are what you appear to be, the week will settle the question. If not, we part without hard feelings." He put his hat back on his head. "That is fair. You can stay in the bunkhouse. Pete sets the schedule of the bunkhouse, and that's his domain." "Understood. One more thing, Mr. Holt." She waited until he was looking directly at her. "This is my ranch. I run it. I will listen to your experience and your opinion, and I value both, but the decisions are mine. If that arrangement is acceptable to you, then we can proceed." There was no hesitation in him. None of the bristling or the careful politeness that masked resentment, the thing she had learned to read in men since she had started giving orders. He just said, "That is exactly the arrangement I was hoping for, ma'am." She reached out and shook his hand. His grip was firm and brief and professional, and yet she was aware of it in some distant, honest part of herself, as the grip of a person rather than just a coworker, the warmth of another human being after months of being largely alone inside her own determination. She said nothing about this. She let it pass, and they rode back toward the barn to discuss what needed doing first. The first week was remarkable. Jesse Holt worked with a quality that Eleanor had not encountered even in experienced hands. Not frantically, not showily, but with a steady, almost inexhaustible competence that made her feel the weight of her burdens shifting. He replaced the north fence posts and restrung the wire before the first day was out, and it was done well, the posts seated deep and the wire tensioned correctly. The following morning he rode the full fence line, all of it, the whole perimeter of the property, something that would have taken Eleanor 2 days on her own. He came back with a list of 7 additional spots that needed attention, ranked in order of urgency, written in a neat hand on a piece of paper that he had folded and carried in his shirt pocket. He handed it to her across the kitchen table, and she read it twice. "You can write," she said, which was not a question exactly, but surprised her. "My mother was a schoolteacher," he said. He got along with Ruddy and Carl Simmons in the way of a man who knew how to earn respect from young men without demanding it. He didn't talk down to them. He just did things better than them and without making a point of it, and they followed his lead naturally. He treated Pete Dawson with the respect due an experienced man who was temporarily out of commission, checking in with him daily, asking his opinion on range decisions, which made Pete visibly brighter. He was consistently quiet at meals. He ate what was put in front of him and said thank you, and did not leave the table until Eleanor had risen, which she noticed and did not remark on. He was respectful to Clara in the direct, uncondescending way of an adult who genuinely liked children but didn't perform it. He answered her questions honestly, teased her gently about the cats she had named, and once, on the 5th day, spent 20 minutes showing her how to properly bridle a horse when she asked him to. Eleanor watched that from the barn doorway and felt something in her chest that she immediately set aside. On the 7th day, she rode out to check on the creek bank erosion with Jesse, because she had been thinking about the problem for weeks and had ideas but no second opinion she trusted. They stood on the bank in the mid-morning heat and looked at the undercut earth. "Willow stakes," Jesse said. "Plant them along the water line. In a season the roots will hold the bank. There is a stand of willows a quarter-mile upstream." She had been thinking the same thing. The fact that they had arrived at the same answer independently gave her a small, warm satisfaction that she examined only briefly before moving on. "I will write to your former employer today," she said, "but I do not think I need the letter to make my decision." He looked at her sideways, the wide brim of his hat cutting a line of shadow across his face. "What is your decision?" "You are hired," she said. "Properly, full wages, through at least the September drive." He nodded, and something in the set of his jaw relaxed very slightly, in the way of a person who had not let themselves show how much they wanted something until they had it. They cut the willow stakes that afternoon, the two of them working upstream with a hatchet, and drove them into the creek bank with a wooden mallet. It was hard work in the heat and the mud, and by the time they were done Eleanor had mud to the knee of her shortened skirts and Jesse had it to his elbows, and Clara, who had come along and insisted on helping, was muddy from crown to boot. They stood back and looked at the planted bank and the stakes already trembling green in the current of the creek, and Clara said, "Will it work?" And Jesse said, "Come back in October and see." And Clara accepted this as a complete and satisfactory answer. It was the easiest evening Eleanor had had in months. July came in hot and dry, the way Texas Julys always did, with a relentless sky and ground that cracked along the creek edges and the cattle clustering to the water in the afternoons. Eleanor and Jesse fell into a rhythm that was practical and efficient, and had no artifice about it. She trusted his judgment on cattle and he trusted hers on everything related to the ranch's accounts and planning. She set the strategy and he executed it without complaint, and when he had opinions, which he often did, he offered them directly and without pressure, and listened when she agreed or disagreed. He was, she came to understand, an unusual man. Not unusual in ways that made itself a subject. He did not make himself interesting. He simply was, in the quiet of his consistency, different from most men she had known. He did not assume. He did not condescend. He did not look at her management of the ranch the way Harold Greer looked at it, as if watching something doomed. He looked at it the way Pete Dawson was coming to look at it, which was with the steady regard of someone who had stopped being surprised and started being impressed. There was a day in the middle of July when a rider came up the Clearwater road and turned in at the ranch gate without permission, which was not how things were done, and Eleanor was in the yard when he arrived. He was a man from town named Culver, who worked for Harold Greer in an informal capacity that was never quite defined but always felt vaguely like enforcement. "Mrs. Voss," Culver said from his horse, looking around the yard with the particular look of a man taking stock. "Mr. Greer wanted me to remind you that his offer on the property stands, and with the summer going hard, he is willing to add a sweetener, another $100 on top of what he offered in April." Eleanor was very still for a moment. The yard was quiet except for the sound of Jesse and Ruddy working in the near barn, the rhythmic sound of hammering. "Tell Mr. Greer I am not interested," she said. Culver shifted in his saddle. "He says to tell you that the October note on the North 40 is looking difficult, given that you are short a full crew and it is a hard summer. He would consider taking the note as part of the sale, make things easier. Tell Mr. Greer that the October note will be met," she said, and she said it with a certainty she was still working toward making fully true. "And tell him, respectfully, that he should stop sending people to my gate." Culver looked like he was going to say more. Then Jesse appeared in the barn doorway. He didn't do anything, didn't say anything, didn't make a move toward the man. He just leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and looked at Culver with the steady, even look of a man with nowhere urgent to be. Culver looked at Jesse for a moment. Then he tipped his hat at Eleanor and rode back out the gate. Eleanor stood there for a moment after the sound of the horse had faded down the road. Then she turned to find Jesse still in the doorway. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't do anything," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you anyway." She went back to the house, and inside where he couldn't see her, she stood at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood and breathed steadily through the frustration and the worry about October and the quiet, complicated awareness that, when she had turned and found Jesse there, something in her had unknotted. The summer continued its hard work. They drove the cattle through a rotation that Jesse recommended, and Eleanor approved a system of moving them between pastures on a careful schedule to preserve the grass, and it worked better than she had expected. The herd was putting on good weight despite the dry heat. The fence line was in the best condition it had been in years. Clara had taken to following Jesse around in the evenings when he did his end-of-day check of the horses, and Eleanor let this happen because Clara was not in anyone's way, and because Jesse seemed genuinely to enjoy the company, explaining what he was doing in the matter-of-fact way he explained everything. Clara, who had been quiet and grave since her father's death, was beginning to laugh again, small and sudden laughs that surprised her as much as anyone around her. Eleanor noticed and was grateful and tried not to think about what that gratitude meant beyond what it said on its face. The trouble came in the third week of July, as trouble in a Texas summer often did out of the sky. A thunderstorm moved through at night, the kind that arrived without much warning, dark and fast and electrical. It lit the whole valley white every few seconds and brought sheets of rain that turned the yard to mud and the creek to a roaring brown rush. Eleanor was up before it hit, moving through the house to check the shutters and make sure Clara was not frightened. Clara was not frightened. She sat up in bed and watched the lightning with wide, interested eyes and said, "Is it going to flood?" "Not the house," Eleanor said. "Sleep." She went to the window and looked toward the barn. The horses were inside and the cattle had moved to the high ground of the north pasture, as cattle tended to do before a storm. She was watching the creek rise by lamplight when she heard the barn door crash. She was out the back door and across the yard before she had fully thought about it, because a barn door crashing in a storm with horses inside was not a sound she could sit still for. The mud grabbed at her boots and the rain was absolute, warm and blinding, and she got the barn door braced against the wind just as Jesse arrived from the bunkhouse at a run. Together, they wrestled the door into its latch, and then they were both inside, soaked completely, breathing hard. The horses were upset but not panicking. Juniper was stamping, and the big bay, Clearwater, was pressing against the stall boards, but none of them had broken loose. Jesse went to Clearwater first, which was right, because he was the most agitated, and Eleanor went to Juniper, and for a few minutes they just talked to the horses the way you talk to horses in the dark when thunder was crashing overhead, low and constant and certain. When the horses had settled, Eleanor and Jesse stood in the center of the barn in the dim light of the single lantern that hung from the main beam, both of them dripping onto the straw, and for the first time since he had arrived, they were simply two people in a small, warm, enclosed space, and the world outside was loud and dark and the world inside was quiet. "Your boots are going to be ruined," he said. "They are George's boots," she said. "They were already half ruined." She looked down at them and then looked up at him. He had pushed his wet hair back from his face and the lantern light caught the planes of it, the straight line of his jaw, the shadow at his temples, the dark directness of his eyes. She looked away. "Thank you for coming out," she said. "I was awake." Still, there was a pause that was not uncomfortable so much as full of something that neither of them addressed. Outside, the thunder moved east and the rain began to ease. "You should get back to the house," he said. "Clara will be wondering." "Clara is asleep," Eleanor said, and she said it and then was immediately aware that she had said it and what it implied, though she had not meant anything by it other than the fact. He heard it too. She could tell something in his posture shifted fractionally, a careful, considered stillness. He said, "I will check the creek in the morning first thing, make sure the bank held." "Thank you, Jesse." She said his given name. She had been saying Mr. Holt for 6 weeks, and suddenly she had said Jesse, and it was out there between them as plain as the rain on the roof. She did not apologize for it. She simply turned and walked back to the house. In the morning the willow-staked bank had held, which she noted with something that felt almost like joy. August arrived, and with it the final push before the drive. There was a cattle drive to organize the logistics of moving 214 head to the stockyards at Fort Worth, a 2-week journey, which meant hiring additional help for the drive itself, securing a trail route, communicating with the buyers. Eleanor had done this alongside George twice before, and she knew the shape of it, but she had never organized one herself. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and the map and her notes on 3 evenings in a row, and on the 3rd evening Jesse came to the back door and knocked, which he always did, and she told him to come in, which she always did, and he looked at the spread of papers and said, "May I look?" She moved aside and he sat down across from her and looked at the map and the notes. He did not take over. He looked and then he asked questions, and she answered them, and they talked it through, the route, the buyers, the timing, the cost of hiring 2 extra riders for the drive. "I know 2 men in Ridgeway who are reliable trail riders," he said. "I worked with both of them 2 years ago. I could write to them." "Do it," she said. He wrote the letters that evening at the kitchen table while Eleanor mended Clara's dress at the other end of the table and Clara slept in the next room. It was a quiet, ordinary domestic scene, and it felt to Eleanor simultaneously completely natural and absolutely extraordinary, because it was natural in the way that things were natural with someone you were beginning to love, and she had been telling herself for weeks that she was not doing that. She finished her mending and looked up, and he was folding the letters, pressing the crease with his thumb. His hands again. She had thought about his hands more than she was comfortable with. "Jesse," she said, and he looked up. She was going to say something practical, something about the drive or the buyer correspondence or Pete Dawson's knee. She knew she was. Instead she said, "Do you find it strange working for a woman?" He considered the question seriously, which was the way he considered everything. "I find it easier than I expected," he said, "and better than most of the situations I have worked in." That is a careful answer. It is an honest answer. He set down the letters. "Is there something specific you are asking?" Eleanor pressed her lips together for a moment. "The town thinks I should have sold in April. Some of the people I see in Clearwater look at me like I am an object of either pity or entertainment. I would like to know if the man working at my side thinks the same." Jesse Holt looked at her across the kitchen table for a long, level moment. "No," he said. "What I think is that you are the best manager I have worked under, and I have worked under 8 ranch operators in 10 years. You see the land and the cattle clearly. You make decisions based on facts rather than habit, and you do not give up when things are difficult." He paused. "I think you are going to get those cattle to Fort Worth and pay your note and be standing on this porch come spring with your hands clean, and I think the people who bet against you are going to look at their feet when they pass you on the street." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said at last, and she meant it in a way that went far deeper than the words could carry. He picked up the letters. "I will take these to town in the morning." He said good night and went back to the bunkhouse, and Eleanor sat at the table alone for a long time after, listening to the prairie quiet outside the window. The 2 men Jesse had written to, older cowboys named Sam Hill and Tucker Barnes, arrived in the 2nd week of August, and from the moment they came through the gate, the energy of the ranch changed. They were experienced, capable, and they took their cue from Jesse without being told, which meant they took their cue from Eleanor. The ranch was suddenly working at full capacity, and Eleanor felt the difference in her bones, the particular relief of a burden shared by people who were competent at sharing it. There was one evening in August that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life, though it was outwardly unremarkable. She had been to Clearwater for supplies and correspondence, and she had run into Harold Greer on the main street. He had just stopped her on the boardwalk, blocking her path with that patient, proprietary certainty of his, and said, "Mrs. Voss, I must say I am surprised. I had thought by August we might be talking business." She had looked at him steadily. "You may say it," she said. "But I am not surprised, Mr. Greer, because I always intended to be right here in August, on my way to market. Excuse me." She had walked around him and not looked back, and the feeling of that, the clean, simple fact of walking through a space that a man had tried to fill with the weight of his certainty, had felt better than anything she could have paid for. She had stopped at the store and bought molasses and coffee and a paper of pins, and on the way home she had passed the little church where George was buried, and she had pulled the wagon over and sat for a moment. "I am doing it," she said quietly, to the headstone she could not see from the road but knew was there. "Clara is all right. The ranch is all right. I am going to take the cattle to Fort Worth, and I am going to come home, and it is going to be all right." She held the reins in her hands, and the afternoon light was long and golden on the grass. "There is a man," she said after a while, and then stopped, because she was not sure what she was going to say next, and the truth of what she was feeling was still taking shape inside her. She drove home. That evening after supper, Jesse was on the porch sharpening a knife, a task he did with the same focused, unhurried quality he brought to everything, and Eleanor came and sat in the other chair, which she did sometimes in the evenings when the day's work was done, and they sat for a time in the way they had grown accustomed to, which was comfortable and easy and full of things that were not said. "I saw Greer in town," she said. "What did he say?" She told him, and he listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, the whetstone still. "What did you say?" he asked. She told him that too, and he made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was something close to it, something that had warmth in it. "Good," he said. "I am a little angry at him," she said. "Not a lot, but a little." "That is appropriate." She looked sideways at him. The porch was in shadow, but the sky beyond was still lit with the last of the day, a deep amber that had gone pink at the horizon and would be dark in 20 minutes. "Jesse," she said, and something in the way she said it was different from the way she usually said it, different from the practical evening porch talk, and he heard it too because the whetstone stopped moving entirely. "Yes." He turned to look at her. "I want to say something, and I am not sure how to say it, so I will simply say it." He waited. "I am glad you stopped at that fence post," she said. "I am glad you asked to see the ranch. I am glad you are here." He was still for a moment that felt very long. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, her Christian name, not Mrs. Voss, not ma'am, and she felt it like a physical thing, soft and serious. "Yes." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, the knife and stone in his hands, and he looked at her with a directness that was familiar from every conversation they had ever had, but with something in it that was new, or rather that was the same thing but undisguised. "I have been trying very hard," he said, "not to make your life complicated." She understood him perfectly. "Is that what you have been doing?" "Yes." "That is considerate of you," she said. She folded her hands in her lap. "For what it is worth, I have been doing the same." The silence that followed was very still and very charged, in the way of a sky before rain when you are standing in a field and can feel it coming. "I think," she said carefully, "that we should drive the cattle to Fort Worth and settle the October note and get through the winter, and then we should have an honest conversation." "That is very sensible," he said. "I am a sensible person." "You are," he agreed, and the warmth in it was so plain that she had to look away to keep herself from smiling in a way she was not ready for him to see yet. She said good night and went inside, and she stood in the kitchen for a long moment with her hand on the table, feeling the pounding of her own heart, which she noted was considerably more alive than she had permitted herself to recognize in quite a while. The drive to Fort Worth happened in the first week of September. Eleanor organized it with the precision she brought to everything: provisions, the trail map, the order of the cattle, the rotation of night watches. Pete Dawson stayed at the ranch with Clara, who had made Eleanor promise 4 times that she would come back with stories. And Eleanor rode out with Jesse and Sam Hill, and Tucker Barnes and Ruddy and Carl Simmons, and 214 head of cattle that she had raised and fed and moved through a dry summer. The trail north was long and physically punishing in the way that cattle drives always were. The days were hot and the nights were cold with the early September wind, and the cattle were unpredictable and the miles were miles. But the crew was good. Jesse ran the ride with calm efficiency, reading the cattle and the terrain with the ease of a man who had done it many times, and he checked in with Eleanor at every stop, giving her his assessment of pace and cattle condition, taking her decisions back to the crew. There was a night on the 3rd day when the herd was restless, something in the wind, some sound they didn't like, and Eleanor was on her horse in the dark doing a perimeter check when Jesse fell in beside her, materializing out of the dark the way experienced horsemen did, soundlessly. They rode side by side in the dark for a while without talking, watching the cattle, feeling the herd's mood through the subtleties of their movement. "They will settle in an hour," he said quietly. "I think so," she said. They kept riding. The stars were extraordinary out here, away from the lamp glow of any town, a river of light across the whole sky, and Eleanor tilted her head back for a moment and looked at them and thought, with the simple clarity that came sometimes in the middle of hard work, that she was very happy. Not happy like the easy happiness of an easy life, happy like the deep happiness of doing something that was right and real and entirely yours. "Jesse," she said. "I lied." He was quiet for a beat. "About what?" "About waiting until after Fort Worth to have an honest conversation." She heard him exhale something that was almost a laugh. "I am listening," he said. "I know this is not the ideal moment," she said. "We are on a cattle drive in the dark and there are things that could go wrong at any minute." "Those are all true things," he agreed. "But since we are here and the night is long—" She paused, looking out at the moving shapes of the cattle in the dark. "I care about you, more than is strictly professional. I have been caring about you since about the middle of July, and I have been managing it quite well, I think, but I thought you should know." He was quiet for a few seconds that felt enormous. "Eleanor," he said finally, "you do not have to say anything." "I want to say something," he said. "I have been, since about the 4th day, if I am being accurate, I have been trying to figure out how a man tells a woman who is also his employer that he is half in love with her without making her feel that the entire working relationship was based on something other than what it was." "Half in love," she repeated. "At minimum," he said, and now she could hear the smile in it, low and real. She breathed in the night air, dust and grass and cattle and the cool above of the open sky. "When we get to Fort Worth," she said, "and the cattle are sold and the deal is made, I would like to have supper with you, not as employer in hand, as people." "As people," he agreed. They finished the perimeter check in a silence that was the happiest silence Eleanor could remember. Fort Worth was everything a cattle town was in 1878, loud and crowded and smelling of livestock and industry, with the stockyards full of bawling cattle and the streets full of drovers and buyers, and the particular energy of commerce conducted at volume. Eleanor negotiated the sale herself, with Jesse standing at her shoulder in the way she had asked him to present, in case she needed a second set of ears, but quiet, not speaking unless spoken to by her. The buyer, a man named Alcott, had started by offering a price that assumed she did not know what she had. She had told him what she had: grade, weight, health, condition in specific factual terms, and she had named her price, which was fair. He had made a counter. She had moved slightly, not all the way. He had made another counter. She had accepted it. When she came out of the stockyard's office with the draft in her hand, she stopped on the steps and looked at it for a moment. It was enough. More than enough. The October note would be paid, the winter supplies would be bought, and there would be money left. Not a lot, but enough. Jesse was beside her on the steps. He was looking at the draft too, and then he looked at her face and he said nothing, because he could see everything he needed to. She folded the draft carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. "Supper," she said. "Supper," he agreed. They found a restaurant, a real one, with tablecloths and a printed menu, not a trail camp supper, and they sat across from each other with the noise of Fort Worth going on around them, and they talked for 2 hours. They talked about things they had not had occasion to talk about on the ranch, or had not allowed themselves to, about where they had come from, and what they had wanted, and what they were afraid of, and what they loved. She told him about meeting George when she was 19, how they had come to Texas from Missouri with almost nothing, and built the ranch from a quarter section and a handshake loan from George's uncle. She told him that she had loved George truly, and that she missed him, and that the missing him was no longer the consuming grief of April but something quieter and permanent, like the creek, always present, always real, but no longer threatening to drown her. He told her about New Mexico, about his mother, the school teacher, and his father who had died of a fever when Jesse was 14, and how he had gone to work on ranches because it was what he knew and it turned out he was good at it, and how the last 2 years of drifting since the Panhandle Ranch was sold had been the loneliest of his life. "You are good at what you do," she said. "Better than good." "So are you," he said. "I know," she said, and smiled, and he smiled back. They looked at each other across the tablecloth in the warm light of the restaurant, with the noise of the city all around them and the day's work behind them, and Jesse reached across the table and set his hand over hers very lightly, no pressure, just present, the way all the best things in life tended to arrive without insisting. She turned her hand over under his. "Come home to the ranch," she said, and by home she meant both the place and the word itself, the full weight of it. "I'm already planning on it," he said. They rode home with the crew over the following days, the cattle sold and the money secured, and when they came up the Clearwater Creek Road and saw the white of the ranch house in the distance and the morning smoke from the chimney Pete making coffee, Eleanor felt something she had not felt in months settle over her like a blanket. It was not relief exactly. It was rightness. Clara was out the front door and down the porch steps and across the yard before the horses were through the gate, running flat out with her arms wide, and Eleanor dismounted in time to catch her and hold her, and over Clara's shoulder she could see Pete Dawson on the porch with his hat raised and his bad knee apparently well enough for the occasion, because he was standing straight. "We did it," she said into Clara's hair. "I knew you would," Clara said, with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who had never doubted her mother. Jesse paid out Sam Hill and Tucker Barnes their trail wages and shook their hands, and they rode back toward Ridgeway, and Ruddy and Carl Simmons went to the bunkhouse for what they called the best sleep of their lives, and Pete made enough coffee for everyone and brought it to the porch, and they all sat in the late morning and said nothing necessary for a long time. October arrived, and Eleanor rode to Clearwater and paid the note on the North 40 acres in full at the bank, which meant sitting across the desk from Harold Greer and handing him the money while he looked at it with the expression of a man recalibrating a long-held assumption. "I am glad the drive went well," he said, pleasantly enough. "Thank you," she said. "The Voss Ranch is not for sale, Mr. Greer. I want to be clear about that once and for good." He met her eyes. Something in him, some last calculation shifted. "Understood, Mrs. Voss," he said, and she believed him. She walked out of the bank into the October sunshine and stood for a moment on the boardwalk of Clearwater, Texas, and watched the street go about its business. Agnes Hartley waved at her from across the way and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that was different from the pitying kindness of the spring. Denton, the storekeeper, came to his doorway and said, "Mrs. Voss, I heard you got a fine price in Fort Worth. Congratulations." She thanked him. The town had been watching. They had watched and they had assumed and they had been wrong, and they were beginning, in the way of small towns that adjusted slowly but eventually, to understand that. She rode home in the golden October afternoon, and Jesse was mending the east fence, still mending something, always in productive motion, and he straightened up when he heard Juniper's hooves on the road and pushed his hat back on his head. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. "Paid in full in person," he grinned. It was one of the few times she had seen him grin fully, not the quiet warmth she had come to know, but an open, happy thing that changed his whole face, and she sat on Juniper for a moment just looking at it. "Get down off that horse," he said, "and celebrate for 5 minutes before you find the next thing that needs doing." She laughed. It surprised them both, because it was full and unguarded and genuine, the kind of laugh that only came when something was truly, completely funny. She got down off the horse. The autumn was the gentlest thing that had happened to Eleanor since the spring. The ranch had settled into its winter preparation routine. Cattle moved to the winter pasture, hay laid in, equipment winterized, and the pressure of the driving season was behind them, and the pressure of the debt was behind them, and what was left was the daily, sustaining work of a place that was alive and healthy. She and Jesse fell into each other the way two people fall who have been carefully not falling for months, gradually, and then completely. There was an evening in October when they were both in the barn doing the last of the day's checks, and she was reaching for a lantern hook and he reached past her to get it, and they were suddenly very close in the narrow space between the stall boards, and they both stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "Eleanor." In that way he had said her name since the porch, with the full weight of everything he meant by it. "Jesse," she said. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that happened between two people who had been thinking about it long enough to know what they meant by it, careful and serious and warm. One hand at the side of her face, and she leaned into it because it was true, because it was the thing she wanted. And outside the barn the October night was cold, and inside it was warm, and it all felt exactly right. When they broke apart she was looking at him and he was looking at her, and he said, "I am not going anywhere. I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said, and she did, and the knowing of it was the best feeling she had known in a year. Clara, who was nobody's fool and had been watching both adults with the patient, observant eyes of a child who has survived a hard year and become wise in it, said at breakfast the following morning, with her spoon poised above her oatmeal, "Are you and Jesse going to get married?" Eleanor nearly knocked over her coffee cup. "Clara, Pete says you are making eyes at each other," Clara said, unperturbed. "Pete says it is obvious." Eleanor pressed her lips together against a smile and said, "Pete should mind his fence line." Clara considered this. "But are you?" "Eat your oatmeal," Eleanor said. Jesse had arrived at the kitchen door in the middle of this exchange. She could tell by the silence on the porch before the knock, and when he knocked and she said, "Come in," he came in with an entirely too carefully composed expression for a man who had been standing in the cold for 3 seconds. "Good morning, Clara," he said. "Good morning, Jesse," Clara said. "I asked Mama if you are getting married." Jesse sat down at the table and reached for the coffee pot with the calm of a man who had decided the only viable response to this situation was composure. "Is there biscuits?" he said. Clara looked between them with bright, interested eyes. "You did not answer." "There are biscuits," Eleanor said, putting them on the table, because the biscuits were a better answer than anything she was currently prepared to give. But she was thinking about it. She was thinking about it a great deal. November settled in cold and clear, with frost on the grass in the mornings and the horses putting out great clouds of breath in the early hours. The ranch was quiet in the way winter ranches were quiet, not idle, but calmer, with the urgent pace of summer, and fall eased into the steadier rhythm of cold weather work. One afternoon in early November, Jesse found Eleanor at the kitchen table with George's old leather Bible open in front of her, not reading it, just having it out, which she did sometimes when she needed to think. He sat down without being asked, which he did now, because the kitchen table had become their place, the place they talked through the ranch business and the day's problems and, increasingly, other things entirely. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me." He looked at his hands for a moment, those hands she had thought about since July, and then he looked at her. "I have been on this ranch since June. I came as a hand. I want to stay as something else, and I want to do things correctly, which means I am asking you plainly, would you consider marrying me?" The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was moving through the grass, which she could hear through the walls. "Jesse," she said, "You do not have to answer today," he said. "I know it is, Jesse," she said again, and reached across and put her hand over his, which stopped him. "I have been thinking about it since Clara asked at breakfast." He looked at her. "Yes," she said, "I would consider it. I am in fact quite certain of it." The smile that came over his face was slow and full, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a year that had had both terrible and beautiful things in it, and she found herself smiling back in the same unhurried, certain way. "Clara is going to be insufferable about being right," he said. "She is going to be exactly that," Eleanor agreed. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her face in both his hands and looked at her for a moment in the winter light of the kitchen window before he kissed her. And it was different from the barn, fuller, somehow, with more of the future in it. And she held onto his shirt front with both hands like someone holding onto something real. They told Clara that evening. Clara looked at Jesse, and then at her mother, and then back at Jesse, with an expression of tremendous satisfaction. "I told you," she said, "to no one in particular." Pete Dawson was informed the following morning, and his reaction was to shake Jesse's hand for a very long time while saying nothing, which communicated everything he needed to communicate. They were married in December, at the small church in Clearwater, on a clear cold day with frost on the ground, and the light coming in bright and sharp through the church windows. Agnes Hartley had helped Eleanor with the flowers, dried prairie flowers and cedar boughs, because there was nothing fresh in December, but it was beautiful in the honest, spare way of things that grew from a real place. Eleanor wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool, and her hair was down and pinned simply with 2 combs, and when Jesse saw her at the church doorway, he stood up very straight and looked at her with an expression of such complete, unambiguous love that the minister had to ask him twice to move to the correct spot. Clara stood beside her mother through the ceremony in a new dress that Eleanor had made from cloth she had brought back from Fort Worth, serious and pleased in equal measure. The vows they exchanged were the traditional words, worn smooth by 100 years of use, and they meant them exactly. After the ceremony, in the cold, bright afternoon, Eleanor stood on the church steps with Jesse's hand in hers and looked out at Clearwater, Texas, in December 1878. The street was quiet in the winter way, smoke from chimneys, horses standing at hitching rails with their breath making small clouds, the sky blue and enormous above the flat line of the plains. Harold Greer came out of the bank across the street just then and saw them on the steps, and he stopped, and he did the thing Eleanor had predicted. He looked at his feet. Not for long and not unkindly, just the brief, recalibrating look of a man updating his understanding of the world. He tipped his hat. Eleanor nodded back. "Ready to go home?" Jesse said, low and warm beside her. "Yes," she said. The winter was long and cold, and they spent it working the ranch by day and sitting beside the fire in the evenings, with Clara between them doing her letters. Jesse had taken over from Eleanor as Clara's tutor in arithmetic, which he was better at, and Pete doing his own quiet reading across the fire, his bad knee stretched out before him and generally improving. The ranch felt complete in a way that it had not felt since April, and Eleanor recognized that completeness for what it was. A household, a real one, built not by accident but by deliberate choice. In January, the town of Clearwater had its winter social at the church hall, and Eleanor and Jesse attended together. This was the first time Eleanor had attended a social event of any kind since George's funeral, and she was aware of the attention as they came through the door, the quick assessments, the recalibrations, the particular quality of attention that a town gave to a person it had misjudged. Agnes Hartley came directly to her and embraced her and said, "You look wonderfully happy, Eleanor," and meant it. Martha Greer, Harold's wife, approached them during the evening and said, with a stiff but genuine grace, "I was wrong to say what I said in the store, Mrs. Voss. I see that now." She paused. "I suppose that is Mrs. Holt now." "Eleanor is fine," Eleanor said and smiled, and Martha Greer thawed very slightly. They danced, she and Jesse, on the cleared church hall floor, with the fiddle playing something lively and the room warm and bright with lamps and people. He was not a particularly accomplished dancer. He had said as much before they came, but he was willing and he held her correctly, and they moved through the music together in the imperfect, sincere way of two people who were not performing for anyone. "You are a perfectly adequate dancer," she told him. "That is the most flattering thing you have ever said to me," he said solemnly. She laughed against his shoulder. Spring came back to Clearwater Creek Road, and with it the beginning of a new ranching year. This time, Eleanor was not alone at the edge of the field watching the work accumulate. She and Jesse sat together with the ledger in the evenings, planning the year's rotation, discussing the purchase of 4 additional breeding cows from a seller in Ridgeway, working through the budget with the careful, shared attention of two people who were building something together. Pete Dawson's knee had healed well enough over the winter that he was back on horseback for light work in March, and the joy on his face the first morning he rode out was something Eleanor kept in her memory like a pressed flower. Clara turned 8 in April, and Jesse made her a small wooden horse, carved it himself over the winter evenings while Clara slept, with the patient, focused carving of a man who took doing things properly seriously. Clara accepted it with the grave, enormous pleasure of a child who understood she had received something made with real care, and she put it on the table beside her bed where she could see it in the mornings. There was an afternoon in May when Eleanor stood at the south fence, the same fence where Jesse had first appeared, where she had first seen him reading the notice, where everything had begun, and looked out at the ranch in the spring light. The cattle were in good condition. The creek bank was holding, and the willows they had staked were beginning to put out real leaves, pale green and trembling in the wind. The house was solid. The fences were sound. The ledger was in the black barely but truly. She heard horse hooves behind her and turned. Jesse rode up on Clearwater, his tall bay, and stopped beside the fence. "Pete wants to know about rotating the herd to the east pasture this week," he said. "Tell him yes, I was thinking the same thing." She turned back to the view. He was quiet for a moment. "What are you looking at?" he said. "I am looking at it," she said simply. "All of it." He understood. He got down off his horse and stood beside her at the fence, looking at the same thing she was looking at, the grass and the cattle and the creek and the sky and the whole enormous, improbable fact of the ranch that existed because she had refused to let it not exist. "Eleanor," he said, "I have something to tell you." She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance, at the cattle and the spring grass, and he had that expression of careful composure he wore when he was trying to be steady about something that affected him deeply. "I got a letter from my sister in New Mexico last week. She said my mother is not well. I should go see her." Eleanor looked at him. "Then go," she said without hesitation. "How long?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. I would take the train from Fort Worth." "Then go, Jesse. We will be here when you get back." He turned to look at her, and she meant it fully, the we, the here, the when you get back, all of it. "I will be back in 4 weeks," he said. "I know you will," she said. He left in the 2nd week of May and was back in the 1st week of June, as he had said he would be. His mother, he reported, was weaker than he had hoped to find her, but better than he had feared. She had kept her school going with a younger teacher who had come to assist. She had been pleased to hear he was married and had asked to see a photograph, which they did not have, and he had described Eleanor to her instead. "What did you tell her?" Eleanor asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I told her you were the most determined and capable person I had ever met, and that you had a laugh that I thought about when I was a long way away from you, and that your daughter had 7 barn cats and all of them had names." Eleanor was quiet too for a moment. "All 9 of them," she said. "Clara added 2 in March." He looked at her. "9. 9, she confirmed, and they both laughed, and the laugh was the welcome home that mattered most. The summer of 1879 was better than the summer of 1878, not because the weather was kinder, which it was not, but because the ranch was better organized, the herd was stronger, and Eleanor and Jesse worked it together with a fluency that came from a year of shared experience. They knew each other's rhythms on the range and off it, knew when to speak and when to simply work in silence, knew the particular shorthand that developed between two people who had built something real. Ruddy Simmons got married to a girl from Clearwater in August and left the ranch for a job on a larger operation nearer to town. Carl stayed on and was becoming genuinely useful, no longer a boy needing supervision, but a young man who could be trusted with real responsibility. Pete Dawson celebrated his 63rd birthday in the bunkhouse, with a cake that Clara had made with Eleanor's guidance, and that leaned significantly to the left, and was the best cake Pete claimed to have ever eaten. The September drive of 1879 was smoother than the one before, because Eleanor knew all the steps and Jesse knew all the terrain, and they had Tucker Barnes back for the drive, a steady man who was becoming a kind of seasonal fixture. They got the herd to Fort Worth in good time and negotiated well and came home with money enough to talk seriously about the breeding stock they had been planning. In October, Eleanor told Jesse that she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, with the coffee still on the stove and Clara not yet up from bed. She said it plainly, as she said most things, though she watched his face with a care she could not quite hide. His face did something that was difficult to describe simply. It moved through surprise and into something so full of feeling that she had to look away for a moment. "Eleanor," he said, "I know it is a great deal with the ranch and—" He had crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her, careful and certain, and she stopped talking and leaned against him, because she was happy and she was a little frightened and he was warm and steady and completely, entirely here. "It is not a great deal," he said into her hair. "It is the best possible thing." Clara was told that morning, and she sat with this information for approximately 30 seconds before saying, "I want a brother." "That is not entirely within our control," Eleanor said. "I know," Clara said, "but I want one. I have a lot to teach." "That is very generous of you," Jesse said with absolute gravity. Spring 1880 arrived with the particular New World quality of springs that come after transformative years. The creek was high with snowmelt from the hills to the north, and the cattle were in good body condition after a winter that had been cold but manageable, and the willow stakes on the south bank had become real willows, young ones, their roots down in the creek mud, their pale new leaves turned to the April light. Eleanor stood on the bank and looked at them. Behind her, Jesse was helping Clara bridle her horse, a small bay pony they had acquired in January specifically for this purpose. And Clara was repeating Jesse's instructions back to him with the focused intensity she brought to learning new things. She was 8 weeks from her time. The baby came in June, on a warm night with a wind from the south and the sound of frogs in the creek. Doc Rawlins came out from Clearwater, and Jesse sat on the porch with Clara, while the doctor and the minister's wife, Agnes Hartley, who had delivered half the babies in Clearwater County, attended Eleanor inside. Clara sat beside Jesse with her hands folded and her face very still, the face she made when she was working hard at not being afraid. "Is Mama going to be all right?" she said. "Yes," Jesse said. "How do you know?" He thought about this seriously, as he always thought about things she asked. "Because she has done every hard thing she set her mind to since I have known her," he said. "And because Doc Rawlins is very good at what he does, and because she has been through harder." Clara considered this. "That is true," she said. The baby came in the early hours of the morning, a boy, solid and loud and entirely himself from the first breath, with Jesse's dark hair and Eleanor's stubborn set to the jaw. Doc Rawlins came to the porch door and said, "You have a son." And Jesse stood up from the porch step so fast he knocked over the chair. Clara said, in a voice that was so completely self-satisfied that Eleanor would laugh about it for years, "I told you." They named him William Holt George for the man who had started this place, and William for Jesse's father, who had not lived to see his son's life come to this. Eleanor held him in the morning light of the bedroom that had been hers and George's and was now hers and Jesse's, and he was small and warm and new, and she thought about all the mornings she had sat at the kitchen table in the dark of that first hard spring and told herself, "All right then." Jesse was in the doorway. He came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, and then at Eleanor, and his face was the face of a man who had everything he wanted and knew it. "George William," he said. "He needs a strong name," she said. "He is going to have a lot to live up to." "He will be fine," Jesse said. "He has a good start." Clara appeared at the door, fully dressed for the day despite it being not yet 6 in the morning, and looked at the baby with the evaluating expression of an older sister making her first assessment. "He is very small," she said. "He will grow," Jesse said. "He is good-looking," Clara allowed. "He has your forehead, Mama." "I will take that as a compliment," Eleanor said. The years turned. The Voss ranch, Voss Holt, as people in Clearwater quietly began to call it, grew. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way things grew that were properly tended. Eleanor's careful management of the breeding program brought the herd from 240 head to close to 400 by 1882. Jesse put in a new hay barn in the spring of 1881, a proper one, big enough for the winters they were getting, and it was the project of 6 weeks that he and Carl Simmons and a Clearwater carpenter accomplished with a workmanlike satisfaction that Pete Dawson supervised from a chair with running commentary. Pete Dawson did not leave. He could not do the range work anymore, not fully, but he ran the yard with the authority of a man who had been there from the beginning, and the yard was always in good order, and the chickens Eleanor had acquired in 1880, a dozen hens and a rooster named Judge, on account of his gravity, were Pete's particular domain. Clara grew into herself with the focused purposefulness of a girl who had watched her mother do the impossible and had internalized this as the baseline of what was normal. By 10, she could ride and rope and read and do accounts, and she was interested in everything that had to do with the ranch. Jesse taught her range skills the way he taught everything, directly, patiently, without condescension, and she absorbed it all with her mother's capacity for taking information seriously. There was an afternoon in 1882 when a man from the Fort Worth Gazette came out to Clearwater. He was writing something about women property owners in Texas, which was becoming a subject of wider interest as the decade progressed, and he asked to speak with Eleanor. She spoke to him on the porch, with the ranch spread out behind her and Jesse somewhere in the middle distance checking the fence on the North 40, and Clara doing mathematics at the kitchen table inside. The reporter was young, a little nervous, with a notebook and a very new hat. He asked how she had managed. She told him. He asked if she had been afraid. She thought about it and said yes, but that fear and stopping were different things. He asked if she had needed help. She said she had had help and that accepting good help when it was offered was not weakness, it was intelligence. He wrote something in his notebook. "And the help you received," he said carefully, "was primarily from your husband." "My husband died in April 1878, she said. "The help that saved this ranch was a man named Jesse Holt, who came by on a June morning and read my notice on the fence post and asked me to show him the ranch, and then had the uncommon sense to take me at face value." The reporter wrote something else. "And is Mr. Holt, he is my husband," she said, "and my partner and the father of my son." She said it plainly, and the reporter nodded and wrote it down, and the article was published in October 1882 and was read by several people in Clearwater and caused a moderate sensation, which faded quickly because moderate sensations did in small towns. Harold Greer had retired by 1882 and moved to Dallas, and the bank in Clearwater had a new manager who was a younger man with less certainty about who should own what land. He and Eleanor had a professional and perfectly cordial relationship. Agnes Hartley remained Eleanor's closest friend in Clearwater for all the years that followed, and they saw each other weekly and talked about everything, the way women who understood each other did. In the fall of 1882, Eleanor sat on the porch in the October evening, the same porch, the same chairs, the same view of the grass going gold under the October light, and Jesse came and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee. She was 32 years old. He was 35. George William was 2. asleep inside with his boots still on because he was his mother's son in the matter of going to sleep when there was still something interesting happening. Clara was 11 and had recently informed both her parents that she intended to run her own ranch someday, a statement that neither of them had questioned for a moment. "Do you remember the first morning?" Eleanor said. "You were sitting on that gray horse," Jesse said, "looking at me over the fence line like you were trying to decide whether I was worth the trouble." "I was deciding exactly that," she said. "What convinced you?" She looked at him, the familiar face, made more familiar by 4 years of daily proximity, every morning light and every evening dark, every hard season and every good one. He had more gray at his temples now, and there were new lines at the corners of his eyes, and she knew those hands as well as she knew anything in the world. "You did not assume," she said. "You just said show me. You let it be what it was." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the land. "It is a good thing," he said, "that I stopped at that fence." "It is a good thing," she agreed, "that you could read." He laughed, and it was the full, open laugh she loved, the one she had earned from him over the years, the one that meant he was completely himself. She leaned against his shoulder and looked at the Voss ranch in the October evening, 412 acres of good Texas grassland, a main house with a new room added for George William, 2 barns, one of which was big and new, the cattle on the north pasture, the willows on the creek bank fully grown now and dark green and real, the fence line straight and sound from one end of the property to the other. The town had assumed she would fail. The town had been wrong. And on the Clearwater Creek Road in the last October light, 2 people sat on a porch with their coffee and their years of shared work and their profound and daily love, and the ranch lived and breathed around them, and inside their children were sleeping. All right then, Eleanor thought, and felt the full, settled weight of everything she had built and been given and refused to give up, and it was more than enough. It was everything. Jesse turned and looked at her in the last light, his eyes dark and warm. "Next year," he said, "I want to put in another 20 acres of hay. The dry summers are getting longer and I want to have more in the barn." She sat up and considered this. "Show me the numbers," she said. He laughed again, and the sound of it went out into the October quiet, across the good Texas grass, and she laughed with him. And above them the stars were coming out one by one in the enormous sky, the same sky it had always been, indifferent and beautiful, witness to everything,